Hello and welcome! In this lecture we're going to create a script to move and rotate our camera based on player input. Alright, so here is the virtual camera that we set up in the previous lecture. We set up all of these settings to make a nice overhead virtual camera. The target object is this empty object right here, and it works perfectly, so if I move this object or I rotate it, everything works perfectly. Now what we want is to make a script so the player can control the camera. So let's make a new C# script, call it the camera controller, attach it to the object and open. And now here let's make a private void update. And on update let's just add some basic input logic. First up we want to construct a move vector based on the player's input. Now for input we're going to go with the simplest method possible, just directly testing for keys. But later on we can easily replace this with some sort of input manager, perhaps even using the new input system or anything like that. But again, for now let's stick with the absolute basics. So let's define a vector3 for the input move direction. By the way, here I'm defining it as a vector3 even though we're only going to move in two axes. The reason for that is because we want to move along the xz axis and not xy. So this, and just create it with 0, 0, 0. Then let's test if the keys are down. So testing if input.getKey. And now here we have two versions, getKey and getKey down. Basically getKey down gets triggered only once when you press a button, whereas getKey stays true for as long as the button is held down. We do want to know while the button is held down, so let's use getKey. And then for the key code, let's use basic was. So let's test for the double key. And if we have that, then let's set the input move direction.z to +1. Then we just need to test for the other directions. So let's test for the S key, test for the A, and test for the D. So if we press on S, let's go -1 on the Z. On A, let's go -1 on the X. And on D, let's go +1 on the X. Okay, so here we have some basic WASD input, and we have our input move direction. Now with this, we really can just use this to move this object directly. However, there is one thing you need to be careful about. Now you might think you could just use this move vector and use it straight on the transform position. So you might think to do something like this, so transform.position plus equals the move direction, multiplied by a certain move speed and time.delta-time. So doing some basic movement, so up here, float move speed, let's say 5 units. So you might think to do it like this. Let's try it and see what happens. Okay, so here we are, and if I move up or down, yep, it looks like it is correct, so I can move any of the WASD keys and it seems correct. However, now if I rotate the camera manually, so let me rotate, apply rotation on the Y, so it's like this, and now I press the W button, and there you go, it's no longer correct. Basically, it's still moving alongside the original axis and not taking the camera rotation into account. It's even more extreme if I put it something like this, so completely looking from the side, and I press the W, instead of moving forward, it's moving to the side. This is not what we want. So instead, let's go back to the code. And here what we want is to use the super useful transform vectors, the forward and right. So let's define a vector3 for the move vector. And now for this one, we're going to take the transform.forward, and we're going to multiply that by the input move direction.z. So we're only going to apply the z to this transform forward, and then we're going to use transform.right and apply that only to the input.x. Since the transform.forward and transform.right, since these are based on the object's rotation, then applying them like this, using them separately, then with this now the movement will be based on the rotation. Let's just apply this one, and the camera was also a bit too slow, so let's put it maybe on 10 units. Okay, so with this let's test. So here we are, and moving normally, yep, WASD, yep, still works. Now let's rotate to the side, so let's put it on -90 degrees. Now if I press on W, yep, there you go, now it does go like that. Now I press on D, and yep, it does go to the side. Alright, awesome, so all of the movement is working regardless of the rotation. Okay, great. So now let's handle the rotation through our input. For this one is also super simple. Like we saw, we already set up the virtual camera to be behind the invisible object. And if we rotate this object, then we're already rotating the camera. It's orbiting around the camera controller point, which is exactly what we want. So the code is super simple. We just have to modify the rotation.y. So over here, how we handle that is super simple. We're just going to need to modify the transform.Euler-Angles. Like we saw, we can verify in the editor which one we need to modify. So if we rotate on the X, then we can see there on the handles what it's rotating like. So this is not what we want. Then if we rotate on the Z, then we get that type of rotation, also not what we want. So what we do want is to rotate only on the Y. So over here it's super simple. Let's just define a vector 3 for the rotation vector. Then we just test for input, so let's test it. In this case, for rotation, let's use the Q and E buttons. So if we're holding down the Q, then let's modify the rotation vector.y. Let's put it on +1. And if we press down on the E, for this one, let's put it to -1. So then we just need to apply this to the Euler angles. So Euler angles, let's increase them by this rotation vector multiplied by a certain rotation speed and by time.delta time. So for the float rotation speed, let's go with something like 100 units. Alright, so with this, let's test. Okay, here we are. So if I press on Q, yep, there you go, rotates, and press on E, and rotates the other way. And if I have the movement, there you go, so regardless of rotation, regardless of where I am, it always rotates. Everything is really nice and perfect. Alright, so far so good. So we already have quite a lot of camera control. We can move up, down, rotate, and everything. So in this lecture, we added movement and rotation, and now in the next lecture, let's add some zoom.